just a very brief amount of time, really kind of focusing on who trans and gender diverse folks are. I also want to acknowledge that there is within this group and more likely outside of this group, there are varying levels of understanding as well as degrees of acceptance around the way cisnormativity or the way cisgendered individuals are privileged in the cancer system. Um, uh, the way that they understand that that exists. And that has a profound impact in terms of how trans and gender diverse folks will navigate and experience the cancer system. And also just want to say that there are lots of questions that folks have about the evidence base that exists for trans and gender diverse folks in cancer. And yeah, I'm not going to answer all of those questions. It's more just kind of providing a bit an overview of what exists, where the gaps are, and what are some potential opportunities for moving forward. And I often like to start my sessions with this quote from Ray Spoon, which was taken from their Medium page. And the reason why I really like this quote, in particular, I think for the context where a lot of folks who are joining us are in kind of the role of providing care, is that there's kind of two elements to I think what Ray is trying to communicate in terms of like the typical experience where they recognize that people are probably not intentionally trying to do harm to them in accessing their cancer care. But the responsibility of trans and gender diverse folks to have to advocate for themselves, to have their identities recognized, is incredibly taxing. Um, and it also underscores that the limitations I think that healthcare providers experience in terms of being able to recognize who trans and gender diverse folks are has to do with the data or the information that is collected about them. So, this invisibility of being trans or gender diverse in the system also impacts the ability to conduct the research that is needed to be able to identify and to be able to develop. Tailored, culturally responsive. I'm not sure what the right word is to describe it, but care that is able to address the unique needs of who trans and gender diverse folks are. And so just to make sure that we're all kind of like operating on the same understanding, uh, is kind of a very brief description of who trans and gender diverse folks are. So very simply, trans and gender diverse folks are individuals whose gender identity and or their gender expression is not aligned with their sex assigned at birth. So there's a lot of different narratives around who trans and gender diverse folks are. A lot of that revolves around this assumption that all trans and gender diverse folks will transition, whether that's a social transition where they change their name and pronouns, or there's some kind of medical transition where they'll undergo some type of surgery, take prosthetic hormones, something to that effect. Um, that is a false assumption. Trans and gender diverse folks are trans and gender diverse just by the experience of not having their gender identity or their expression align with their sex assigned at birth. And I use trans and gender diverse as a term to encompass a wide variety of identities. So, trans is a common term. I identify as non binary. Some folks identify as gender diverse, gender non-conforming, gender queer, and the list can go on and on. And so, for the work that I do, as well as how it helps me kind of conceptualize just the diversity of individuals who exist within kind of this broad umbrella. I use the term trans and gender diverse, but recognize that there are a multitude of ways people may describe the population of individuals whose gender identity or their expression does not align with their sex assigned at birth. And so, for context, it in the most recent Canadian census, about, I don't know why I said about, that's a very specific number. 0.33% of the Canadian population who are over 15 reported being trans or non-binary. So that represents a pretty small proportion of the Canadian population. But what I think is important, particularly from a cancer perspective, is that the majority of those individuals were under the age of 35. And we know that this population is going to continue to increase. There are a lot of young individuals who have a whole lot more space to identify their identity in a multitude of ways. And so while right now the census is saying 0.33, we can expect that number is going to increase. And then as it relates to cancer and thinking about who the population is who's typically diagnosed with cancer, the vast majority of individuals are over 60. So it's very possible that right now individuals are not encountering a lot of trans and gender diverse folks who have cancer. It does definitely happen, but I think what will likely happen is as this population continues to age and as this population continues to grow, is there is the really strong likelihood that clinicians and folks working in the cancer system are going to start encountering more and more trans and gender diverse folks. And there's a real imperative to not just improve systems to be able to recognize and identify those folks, but also to be able to do better research to be able to make sure that the care is actually meeting their needs. And so, before going too far down kind of like the road, I want to take a step back and just talk about the research around trans and gender diverse folks and health, health research generally. And so I want to highlight two particular studies. The first is a fairly recent systematic review that was investigating the types of health conditions that are investigated in research around trans and gender diverse folks. And what I thought was particularly important about this review was that within the literature, there was a really strong emphasis on research to tend to focus on mental health concerns. And a lot of that research identifying that trans and gender diverse folks have a high burden of mental health as well as substance use disorders. The next most common type of topic of research was around sexual health. And in particular, there was a strong focus on sexually transmitted infections and HIV among trans and gender diverse folks. And then the third most prevalent type of research was focused on violence and victimization. And what was significantly underrepresented in the research was cancer. So, in all of the health studies on trans and gender diverse folks, cancer was only represented in 1.6% of all of the studies. And so, why do I think this is important? I think one of the things that really comes to mind immediately is that cancer is not a priority for this population. And I also think in terms about the nature of evidence, and what types of stories we're getting about who trans and gender diverse folks, if the research is focusing on it, trans and gender diverse folks as being individuals with mental health conditions, substance use disorders, being victims of violence, as well as having high rates of sexually transmitted infections and HIV, it really starts to shape the type of knowledge that we create about this population. And I think that and this is not to suggest that these are not important health health outcomes for this population, for trans and gender diverse folks, but it is a really narrow representation of uh, who is being talked about in the studies, and there's a very narrow focus of what research considers to be important for this population. And another thing that I think is also really important in talking about the evidence on trans and gender diverse folks in health more generally is just the type of studies that are being done. So the graph on the right hand side, you can see that the vast majority of studies on this population in health are cross-sectional. And so cross-sectional is can be a really helpful and important study design. But when we think about the type of quality of evidence that is considered to be best for creating treatment guidelines or I'll leave it at treatment guidelines. Uh, we see that there is less and less of the types of studies that are considered to be high quality. So those are things like systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials, randomized controlled trials, and so, why I bring this up is I think it's important to recognize that one of the things that is lacking around the development of clinical care guidelines for this population is um, the type of evidence that I think a lot of clinicians rely on to be able to feel comfortable in making evidence-informed decisions around how to provide care. But do want to say that despite the lack of high quality evidence in terms of how we understand that, there is a very consistent message that trans and gender diverse folks are at high risk of experiencing poorer health outcomes, as well as negative encounters within the healthcare system compared to cisgender folks. And that may not be surprising to most of you, but that is something that definitely has been observed in the cancer research. And so, even though the evidence, there's opportunities for strengthening the evidence. That doesn't mean to say we should ignore that trans and gender diverse folks are have been observed to be at risk of experiencing inequities along multiple phases of the cancer continuum. And I think what's really important to highlight here is that these inequities and these risks are driven by cissexism, which is a unique form of oppression that privileges cisgender individuals and works to make trans and gender diverse folks invisible, to suggest that their needs are not important, and fundamentally works to deprioritize or erase trans and gender diverse folks' cancer experiences. And so what we see in the literature around trans and gender diverse folks and cancer is that this is a population who has frequently reported to experience discrimination with healthcare providers as well as like healthcare systems. That research suggests that there is a lack of inclusive psychosocial support as well as treatment guidelines. Trans and gender diverse folks are at risk of being excluded from organized screening programs due to the way those programs work with provincial or yeah, I'll stick with provinces. America is a bit of a different story. The way the provinces rely on specific sex markers on provincial health cards to determine who is eligible. As well, trans and gender diverse folks have been observed to be at greater risk of having delayed or later stage diagnoses for some cancers. So that's what the research is saying. And there's been a few reviews trying to kind of compile this information and I don't want to say condense it, but synthesize it in a way that could be helpful. And there's a lot. Some of the reviews have focused more specifically on cancer screening, psychosocial care, survivors, queer cancer survivors. But one of the things that in going through this literature, that I kind of observed to be a gap was thinking about how trans and gender diverse folks are described in research. And I think that's a really important element, and I'll talk a little bit more about why. So I am in the final stages of preparing a proof for a completed scoping review related to trans and gender diverse folks, representation and inclusion in cancer research. So this is a scoping review protocol. This was published with CMHA Open, and so if you're curious about it, I would highly recommend checking it out. But do want to say that it has been finalized, and we're currently in the process of getting it published with Cancer Medicine. So when that comes out, I can, if folks are interested, I can send that to you. And what we were interested in exploring with this review was how trans and gender diverse folks are described in cancer research, looking at more specifically the types of data and study designs that were used specific to cancer research with trans and gender diverse folks. And then we also looked at the cancer outcomes along the cancer continuum. Um, we got some feedback from the reviewers after our first submission that the manuscript was too long. So in the end, we didn't publish the cancer results along the continuum, but I'm going to talk about what we found anyway. You just won't see that in the finalized manuscript. And so, in terms of how trans and gender diverse folks in were described in cancer research, we kind of focused on two different elements here. The first was the terminology that was used, and this may be surprising. This may not be surprising, but what we observed was that there was a lot of variation both in terms of like the approaches that individuals or the researchers were using to name trans and gender diverse folks, as well as the terms that were used to describe individual or groups of trans and gender diverse folks. So, how I kind of conceptualized it was one of the approaches was to talk about trans and gender diverse folks using an umbrella term. So, using the term transgender, non binary, or gender diverse. And so this can be a very helpful approach because there is a lot of complexity with the naming and the diversity of identities that exist within this group. But one of the things that is challenging about it is that there is significant diversity within kind of like these broader umbrella terms. And so it makes it really difficult to understand that there will be different experiences within kind of the umbrella of who trans and gender diverse folks. So, as a potential example, if people have this assumption that all trans and gender diverse folks will undergo some type of transition, and that isn't challenged in the literature, there can be kind of like that reinforcement that all trans and gender diverse folks undergo some type of transition when that's not actually the experience. And then while some folks did the large umbrella approach, another approach was to kind of group individuals into to smaller groups. So using more specific terminology. So like trans feminine, trans masculine, the AFAB or AMAB on the slide, assigned female at birth, assigned male at birth, a trans men, trans women. Um, which again, like lots of different variations in terms of how people were describing the more specific populations. um, but one of the things that is challenging is that while it does allow for kind of breaking apart and understanding the diversity that exists within the community, it does make it really hard to generate strong conclusions about the populations because they just keep getting smaller and smaller. The other aspect we were interested in was around how trans and gender diverse folks were operationalized. So just over two-thirds of the studies included some kind of definition, and the vast majority of those definitions focused on that misalignment between someone's sex assigned at birth and their gender identity. Um, which was great to see. But we did also come across a couple of studies who were relying on some of those problematic narratives around kind of individuals wanting to change their sex, or feeling like they belong to the wrong sex. And so, like for some individuals as part of the trans and gender diverse community, that definitely is their experience. But when it becomes problematic is when it doesn't challenge that or recognize that that isn't a universal experience amongst this population. And so, with our second objective, in terms of how we were thinking about how cancer outcomes and experiences are investigated, um, one of the things that was really apparent was that there was a strong reliance on convenience samples. So finding folks who were pretty easily accessible. Many of these studies relied on samples that were from single institutions and in particular specialized gender identity clinics. Um, Another very common approach was that to use the behavioral risk factor surveillance system, which is a national survey done in the United States, who in some states they will collect information about gender identity. There's lots of methodological problems with the way the survey is implemented. In some situations, the survey askers would not ask people about their gender identity. They would just rely on the timbre of their voice to be able to determine how somebody fit. Um, and 15% of the studies that we included came from this particular survey. And why I think that's important is that these only represent a small segment of the trans and gender diverse folks. Not all trans and gender diverse folks will necessarily access care at a specialized gender clinic. Um, the behavioral factor surveillance system also has problems, as I've already talked about. And so within the literature, there really is a small breadth of individuals who are included, which makes it difficult, again, to kind of extrapolate the results to a broader and much more diverse population. And in addition to looking at the ways cancer outcomes are investigated, we were also curious about how many studies are engaging trans and gender diverse folks. And so, in the end, we had 56 studies that we included in our scoping review, and only six of them reported formally engaging them. So that is a really small number, and that is problematic. Not only because there is a growing emphasis in terms of research engaging individuals who were affected by research to be included in their study, but also in thinking about how some of these studies are framed, engaging individuals as part of the trans and gender diverse community could really do a good job of helping kind of tease apart some of the potentially problematic narratives that emerge in the studies. And then, with the respect to the third objective, I'm not going to be able to go through this in a whole lot of detail. For a multitude of reasons, but I think the thing that is like most problematic about trying to tease apart these results is that it was really difficult to generate any meaningfully clear conclusions about many of the phases of the continuum. So as I've already talked about, the way we trans and gender diverse people were described in the study made it very difficult to try to identify commonalities or consistencies. As well, some of the studies like survivorship, diagnosis, only had a couple studies, and that's really difficult to say anything definitively. I would say that the literature consistently did indicate that trans and gender diverse folks, and in particular trans masculine, or yeah, trans mask, non-binary folks experience sex specific, so cervical cancer screening, to be a very difficult experience. And there's not a lot of there's been a lot of reports within this kind of like the cervical cancer screening and it being a site of a significant inequity for trans and gender diverse folks. Um, and in addition to that, would say part of the reason why that is so problematic has to do with embedded assumptions about who is supposed to be accessing sex-based screening, um, where we're thinking about cervical cancer screening. Most people are assuming that cisgender women are the ones who are going to be accessing it. So services and resources are just not typically set up to be able to create or make that space like safe or inclusive. So in terms of some of the key points, again, there was significant variability in the studies that we looked at and a lack of breadth of the data or of who was represented in the study. Um, Strong reliance on observational studies, in particular convenience samples. And one of the things that was consistent in the vast majority of the studies, particularly those that were relying more on secondary data, which was the vast majority of the studies, was that these studies were limited by processes for collecting and using gender identity data. And so, just to kind of emphasize this a little bit more, there is a lot of variation for categorizing gender across the different data systems that are typically used to collect data for this type of research. Many of these systems do not capture gender identity data, and when they do, what ends up happening is they use sex-specific terminology like male or female as opposed to gender terms. Alongside this, there's a lack of inclusive measures that categorize trans and gender diverse folks. Like I said, when gender is an option, um, the values for that option tend to be limited, or in some situations may use potentially harmful language. So some of the things that are seen in the data are terms like hermaphrodite or transsexual, which um, have complicated histories with trans and gender diverse individuals. And in addition to this, we have a lack of appropriate infrastructure for gender data. So the Canadian Cancer Registry, as well as provincial registries, do not have a gender variable. They rely on sex. And we'll note that there are some institutions that are making a lot of important changes with how they collect data, but the way that information flows to kind of those sites where researchers are able to kind of pull that data, there are some really significant limitations. And so while individual clinics may have different ways of collecting information that is useful for trans and gender diverse folks at points of care, that doesn't necessarily translate well to the research base. So in thinking about that, and thinking about wanting to do a PhD and what's going to happen, I, along with my advisors and research team and community advisors, have started a project. And this is a CHR funded project. It's called Beyond the Binary: Gender Diversity and Cancer Health Services Research. And the focus here is really to advance cancer health services researchers' capacity to meaningfully integrate trans and gender diverse folks as well as their priorities into cancer research. And so this is a community-based mixed method study. The blue box is to represent the community advisory, community engagement. So I have 9 community advisors who are helping me and the team with all aspects of the study. Uh, and we've just finished collecting data for objective one. So we've done a needs assessment survey with folks who do cancer health services research to try to get an understanding of their knowledge, their understanding of trans and gender diverse folks, as well as their cancer experiences, um, and the barriers and facilitators that they currently experience to integrating gender diverse folks into their work, as well as their priorities uh, for improving their ability. We are slowly starting to work on objective two, which are focus groups. And so the focus groups are going to be with trans and gender diverse folks across Canada who have a variety of different cancer experiences. And the objective here is to really respond to some of the things that came up in the survey. So, what are trans and gender diverse? So, if researchers are telling us that their one of their problems is that they don't know how to engage trans and gender diverse folks in research. What do trans and gender diverse folks say they should do to be able to engage them in this work? And then we've got some other questions that we're in the process of finalizing right now. But really, it's about trying to get the trans and gender diverse folks to respond to the themes that come up in the survey. And then the ultimate objective is to bring the focus groups and the needs assessments together and ideally create some kind of like best practices for cancer health services researchers. And the reason why I think it's important to focus on this community is, or in this part of the cancer world is, right now they don't have the data to be able to do a robust job of including trans and gender diverse folks in their work. And so in the absence of that data, it's important that they understand what opportunities they have to integrate them into their research. But eventually, the goal is, I think, for them to be able to have data. And so when they have that data, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to automatically translate to them being able to do something with that data. And so we need to also start building their capacity when they have that data, that they are able to use it in a respectful way. So in terms of where we're at, as I said, I have 9 community advisors. I have a large research team that I've already talked about. Data collection for the survey finished yesterday, which was great. And so working with the community advisory board right now on the focus group guide, and then working on the next steps with my committee and the community advisory board around analyzing the results from the survey and then getting the focus groups up and going. And so why I think this study is important, I think from just a research quality perspective, if we don't have data, we're not going to be doing accurate research. Um, and I think also the work that I'm doing does very much align with prioritizing affected communities in research. And I also think that there's an emphasis, or people really want to be able to do this work, but they sometimes feel like they can't because they don't know how, or that they're going to do more harm. And I think that's a really important reflection for individuals. And so hopefully part of this can uh, create more space for individuals to feel like they have the knowledge and skills that they would need to be able to do this work. But also, I'm sure many folks are familiar with what's going on in the States, particularly in relation to um, health research in general. And we'll say that the vast majority of studies on cancer and trans and gender diverse folks come from the United States. And so if that research is not being done, and one of the things that's beneficial about the United States is that they do have some gender identity information, so they can do research that is a little bit more precise than what we can do here. And so if we're not doing that research, it's going to limit our own ability to develop, evidence-informed decisions. And I, early a month ago, I was in Colorado, and I went to a workshop that was specific to sexual gender minorities and cancer research, and it was wild. It was a very interesting experience. And folks are obviously incredibly concerned about what is going to happen in terms of not just their ability to do research, to get grants, career progression, things of that sort, but also how that's going to affect the quality of care that trans and gender diverse folks are going to face. Um, but I think I don't know if this is helpful, but it was helpful for me to kind of hear it from folks who are living through it, in terms of kind of reminding individuals that this is not a unique experience for the trans and gender diverse community. There were times when research on this population was not happening. There has been times when this community has faced significant amounts of uh, violence, discrimination, and harm. Um, but despite all of that, the work continued. Individuals continued to fight for really positive change. And one of the things that I think is helpful for me in thinking about my work and how I can support my colleagues down in the States uh, is that I think there's much greater visibility and we have much greater, um, we have we have more allies than we've ever had. And so I think it's just for me, that's just like a really important reflection in terms of thinking like I see what's happening, but I also know that there are individuals who are very much committed to um, keeping on doing this work. And I think if there are opportunities we can take to be able to support them, this is when we get to. So that's all I have. I know it may be a little bit longer than typical, but I do want to, um, yeah, that's it for me.
Mhm. Thank you very much, Morgan. And I appreciate you wrapping it up on that note, because watching what is happening to the south of us, uh, it is, well, the one of the headlines said mind-boggling. It truly is mind-boggling. So thanks for the reminder that there are still good people doing good work. Um, and thank you for that presentation. We have 8 minutes left in our
Sorry.
hour. No, that's okay. So I want to open it up for questions. That's really, I think, an important part of our community of practice is that we have time for dialogue. And so I'll open it up if anyone wants to uh, ask a question or share a thought or anything related to what Morgan has been talking about. Yeah, Kim,
Hi, thank you so much, Morgan, for
can you
sharing.
put your microphone down again?
Oh, sorry. Sorry. I
Okay.
know I've been trying to like deal with patient stuff as I like, tuning in, but thank you so much for sharing. This is just really, really important work. And I really appreciate when you spoke about people feeling like apprehensive about participating in this kind of work because they don't want to do additional harm. And I'm fairly new to the equity space. And so I wonder if you have any resources to share, like as a frontline clinician, I don't see a lot of very visible work being done around gender diversity, and that could just be like my own ignorance. And so like what is the best way to start that conversation and to be able to engage with an organization in order to push those things forward? Because I know that in other like when I've had other trainings within my organization or meetings, like there's been some talk about it, but like yeah, it's just the transparency sometimes is a little bit hard in.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lots of different elements that you could consider. I think yeah, I'm not like 100% clear in terms of your question in terms of where you're wanting to focus. Is it more kind of like at an operational level? Like how do you implement change kind of like from an organizational level that does not create harm? Is that kind of
Yeah, like especially, yeah, exactly.
okay?
Yeah.
I think a really important thing is that community needs to be involved.
Okay.
That is, by and large, I think the thing that's going to be the most beneficial. So, I know the work that's happening in Manitoba, there's a kind of a community advisory board who's providing guidance around collection of gender, sex, and sexual orientation information.
Mm.
Um, but also, uh, I think that there needs to be recognition that even though we're collecting that information, that doesn't necessarily mean people are going to know what to do with it.
Right.
And so again, I think community needs to be involved kind of like in a holistic perspective in terms of this is what I'm hearing from the community, this is what they're saying they want, and also recognizing that the community is incredibly diverse.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and so as part of that, I think it's like recognizing it's not one and done. Our I can't even keep up with the way the community is changing. Like it is really hard to stay on top of everything, and I think like that is a real challenge. Our language is constantly evolving, and it's amazing and it's wonderful. But like my researcher brain is like, no, that's really hard. Like how do we deal with this? But I think it's really important that these relationships are built with the community and they are the ones who are telling you what it is that you need to be doing and how you should be doing it.
I really appreciate that. I think that that helps me to sort of find ways because the way I've been thinking about it has been like top down from an organization down, and it
Yeah.
really needs to be from community upward. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's both. I think
Yeah,
but the community voice like it needs to be very clear. But also people who make decisions need to be able to make decisions.
absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just flagging to Kim that there's a couple of links put in the chat for resources. So you may want to have a quick look at that. Is there anyone else that has a question, comment? Um,
Hi, I do, if no one else does. We heard you talk about the importance of, involving people that weren't just sampled conveniently, like convenient sampling, which is what most people do because accessibility is really difficult and mistrust and all of that sort of stuff. And we sometimes get approached by researchers asking us to access, people in the community, but we're currently doing a research study on trans and gender diverse people with gynecological cancer, and we have a community partners, but we're facing the same thing. It's like, how do you reach the people that aren't the easily reachable people? So, and this is a,
Hmm.
and I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but do you have any advice to move away from that kind of convenient sampling?
Nope, not at the present time. But I will say that I had a meeting with my community advisory board a couple weeks ago, and this was something we talked about. And so one of the questions that we'll be asking in the focus group is around what people from the community think would be helpful to reach more marginalized and hidden populations. And I think like the trans and gender diverse community is complex because there are individuals who, for all intents and purposes would kind of like fit as being a trans and gender diverse person, but they wouldn't necessarily identify as such. And so that also makes it really, really complicated. Um, so at this point, I don't have any suggestions.
Mhm.
I think not on my project hat. Like if I take my project hat off aside, I think like honestly, there's some community groups who I in Winnipeg who I think would probably be really valuable partners in terms of helping me do this work. Um, but the time and energy that would be required to kind of invest in those relationships to be able to uh, build that trust. I don't think I can do kind of like within my PhD program. And so maybe part of it is like working with groups and organizations who are not typically like research friendly. It's kind of going into those spaces where there's a level of skepticism and distrust and spending an amount of time, building those relationships and trying to like foster some opportunities for collaboration.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were saying the other day that one of our taglines should be like relationships over research because that's the key.
Hmm.
Thank you.
Totally.
Thanks,
It
Morgan.
takes a long time. And I think like uh our community is very fragmented. and what works for some groups is not necessarily going to work for all groups. And I think that's just that's part of it.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate your honesty. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Amanda. Good to see you.
You too.
Yeah, thanks, Morgan. I think that sort of, translates into other equity focused research too, is that, the people that you really want to and need to reach, it can be really difficult. It takes a lot of resources and a lot of time. But we really we need to do it. Otherwise we don't have the data and the research to kind of meaningfully move forward. We're at 1 o'clock. I wish we had lots more time to talk, but we don't. If anyone wants to
Sorry.
continue, that's okay. If we want to continue conversations offline and you need to connect with someone, let me know and I can connect you. Otherwise, thanks very much, Morgan. Really appreciate you sharing your work, and we hope to see everyone back in June.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Everyone.